The great library of Sylvan Prime stretched across 17 levels, each one filled with knowledge gathered over 12,000 years of galactic civilization. And Ambassador Kethra walked through its ancient halls with the quiet confidence of someone who believed she understood the universe. She was wrong. The Concord of Seven had ruled the galaxy for longer than most species could remember, and their archives contained records of every sapient race to ever build a starship and reach beyond their homeworld. And Kethra had studied them all during her years of diplomatic training. There were the Krath, with their warrior culture and massive dreadnoughts that could crack a planet in half. And there were the gentle Valori, who communicated through light patterns and had never known war until they met the other species. And there were the Thornaki, the Esseni, the Moldrith, and dozens of others. But one entry had always puzzled the scholars. It sat in the oldest section of the archive, in records so ancient that parts of them had been lost to time and data corruption. And it spoke of a species called humanity that had come from a small blue world on the outer arm of the galaxy. The records were strange and incomplete, and they described a young species full of contradiction. Beings who could create beautiful art one moment and terrible weapons the next. Creatures who loved deeply and hated fiercely, and seemed to burn with an inner fire that other species found both fascinating and frightening according to the fragments. Humanity had achieved faster than light travel approximately 10,000 years ago and had made brief contact with an ancient race called the Varanti. And then they had simply vanished. Some scholars believed they had destroyed themselves in one of their many wars, and others thought they had been wiped out by disease or cosmic disaster, and most simply dismissed them as a legend. A story cobbled together from the remnants of several failed civilizations. Kars had always belonged to this last group. She was a practical woman with silver blue skin and eyes that had seen 100 worlds. And she had no patience for myths and fairy tales when there was real diplomatic work to be done. The galaxy was a complicated place, and the Concord of Seven worked hard to maintain peace among species who had very different ideas about how the universe should work. And Kethra had spent her entire career trying to prevent the small conflicts from becoming big ones. Today, she stood before the archive's oldest terminal, and her hands trembled slightly as she read the report that had arrived. Just hours ago, a survey ship had discovered something in the Ember Nebula, a region of space so turbulent and dangerous that no one had explored it in centuries. And what they found had shaken the foundations of everything the Concord believed it was a Varanti ship. The Varanti had been extinct for over 9,000 years, victims of a plague that had swept through their worlds before the current Concord had even formed. And yet, here was one of their vessels, ancient beyond measure, but somehow still functioning. The survey team had managed to access its memory banks before the ship finally died, and they had found a single transmission playing on an endless loop, a message in the Varanti language that their translation systems could barely interpret. Ithera read the words again and felt something cold move through her chest. The message spoke of a species called humanity, and it spoke of something called the long sleep. And it ended with a promise that made no logical sense, but somehow sent shivers down her spine. When the stars call for them, they will wake. She pulled up the oldest records on humanity and compared them to the Varanti message. And for the first time in her long career, she found herself wondering if the myths might be true. The ancient texts describe humans as resilient beyond reason, creatures who refused to die, even when the universe seemed determined to kill them. Beings who had survived ice ages and plagues and wars and disasters that would have ended most species. They were said to be impossibly adaptable, able to live in conditions that would destroy other life forms. And they were described as pack-bonding creatures, who formed deep emotional attachments, not just to their own kind, but to other species, and even to machines and ideas. One fragment that had always been dismissed as obvious fiction claimed that humans had once traveled to their own moon using nothing but chemical rockets and metal boxes. A journey so dangerous and primitive that no rational species would have attempted it. Another fragment spoke of human medicine, of their refusal to accept death, of their doctors who would fight for hours to save a single life. Even when all hope seemed lost, Kethra had always laughed at these stories. But now she was not laughing. She contacted the survey team and requested a copy of the Varanti transmission. And when it arrived, she played it in her private chambers and listened to the ancient voice speak words that had been recorded before her species had even discovered fire. The Varanti speaker sounded afraid. And that was what struck Kethra most deeply, because everything she knew about the Varanti suggested they had been one of the most powerful species in galactic history. What could have frightened them so badly? The transmission spoke of humanity's departure, of great ships that folded space itself as they traveled, of technology that the Varanti could not understand even with all their advanced science. It spoke of a promise the humans had made before they left, a vow that they would return one day if the galaxy ever truly needed them, and it spoke of why the Varanti were afraid. They were not afraid of humanity itself, the message explained, but afraid for the galaxy, afraid of what would happen if the humans ever decided that the other species were beyond saving. They could have conquered us all, the Varanti voice said. And Kethra heard ancient wonder and terror mixed together in those words. They had the power and the will and the numbers, but they chose to leave instead. And they said they would sleep until the stars called them back. The recording ended, and Kethra sat in silence for a long time, outside her window. The lights of Sylvan Prime glittered like scattered jewels. And somewhere out there among those countless stars, something was stirring. She could feel it in her bones. A change coming that would reshape everything the galaxy had known for 12,000 years. The myths were not myths at all. Humanity was real. And humanity was waiting. And Kethra had the terrible feeling that the galaxy was about to learn why the Varanti had been so afraid. The war began 3 weeks after the Varanti ship was discovered. And it began exactly the way Kethra had always feared it would. The hegemony of Krath had been growing restless for centuries, their warrior culture chafing against the restrictions that the Concord of Seven placed on conquest and expansion. And they had been waiting for the right moment to make their move. The discovery of the ancient vessel and the confusion it caused gave them the excuse they needed. Grand Admiral Vorath stood on the bridge of his flagship, a massive dreadnought called the Crushing Fist, and he watched with cold satisfaction as his fleet poured into the neutral Kelthis expanse. The Kelthis were a peaceful species who had never developed weapons of war, and they had relied on the Concord to protect them from predators like the Krath. But the Concord was fracturing now. 3 of the 7 refused to act, claiming that the situation was not clear enough to justify intervention. And 2 others sent strongly worded protests that Vorath ignored completely. Only the Sylvani and 2 of their allies were willing to stand against the hegemony, and their combined fleet was barely a third the size of what Vorath commanded. Kethra received the news while traveling to Ashar Prime, a border world that sat directly in the path of the hegemony advance. And she knew immediately that her mission was hopeless. She was supposed to negotiate a ceasefire. But the Krath did not negotiate, not when they smelled weakness. And they could smell it now. The Concord was divided and afraid, and the hegemony was united and hungry for conquest. Ashara Prime was a beautiful world of blue oceans and green continents, home to 3 billion people who had built their civilization on the principles of peace and cooperation. And they were about to be destroyed. Kethra met with the planetary leaders in their capital city, and she saw the fear in their eyes, the desperate hope that somehow the Concord would save them. And she could not bring herself to tell them the truth. The truth was that no one was coming. She stood on the observation deck of the orbital station above Ashar Prime and watched the hegemony fleet arrive. Hundreds of warships dropping out of hyperspace in perfect formation. Their weapons already charging with deadly energy. Grand Admiral Vorath sent his ultimatum across all channels. And his voice was calm and certain and utterly without mercy. "You have 3 solar cycles to surrender unconditionally," he said. "If you refuse, this world will be reduced to glass, and we will move on to the next one and the next, until the Concord understands that the age of weakness is over." Kethra closed her eyes and thought about the Voranthi message, about the ancient promise of beings who had vanished 10,000 years ago. It was foolish to hope. She knew that. But hope was all she had left. She walked to the communication console and began programming a broadcast, the widest broadcast she could manage, across every frequency and every channel and every wavelength that the station could reach. Her aide looked at her with confusion and asked what she was doing. "Something desperate," Kethra answered. "Something probably pointless, but I have to try." She recorded her message in every language the translation computers knew. And then she added something else, fragments of that ancient tongue from the Voranthi transmission. Words she did not fully understand, but spoke anyway. "If you are out there," she said into the void, "if you are listening, if the old stories are true and you promised to return when the galaxy needed you, then please hear me now. Because we need help." She sent the message outward into the darkness between stars. And she felt foolish and desperate and small. The hegemony fleet hung in space like a swarm of metal predators. And Admiral Vorath laughed when his sensors detected her transmission. "The Silvati are calling for mythical saviors," he told his officers. And they laughed with him. "This is what the Concord has been reduced to. Prayers and fairy tales." The hours passed slowly. Kethra stood at her window and watched the hegemony ships maneuver into attack formation. And she counted down the time remaining until the ultimatum expired. 72 hours became 60, then 50, then 40. No answer came from the darkness. She tried to prepare the people of Ashar Prime for what was coming. But what could she say? How could she help them face annihilation? 30 hours became 20, then 10, then 5. The hegemony fleet began powering up their main weapons. Great cannons that could crack a planet's crust and boil away its oceans. And Vorath sent another message to the people below. "Your time is almost up," he said. "Your gods have not answered. Your allies have abandoned you. And your Concord has proven itself worthless. Surrender now or die with your world." Kethra watched the countdown timer reach 0. And she felt tears running down her face as she prepared to witness the death of everything. She had sworn to protect the hegemony weapons. Reached full charge, Admiral Vorath gave the order to fire, and then the stars themselves seemed to break apart. It happened so fast that the sensors could not track it. One moment there was empty space behind the hegemony fleet. And the next moment there was something else, space folded like paper being crumpled by an invisible hand. And reality bent in ways that should have been impossible. And through the wombs in the universe came ships. They were not like any vessels the galaxy had ever seen. Some were massive beyond comprehension, larger than anything the hegemony or the Concord had ever built. And others were smaller, but moved with a speed and precision that seemed to mock the laws of physics. They did not emerge from hyperspace the way normal ships did, with a flash of displaced light and a burst of radiation. Instead, they simply appeared as if they had always been there, and the universe had just now decided to reveal them. The hegemony fleet froze. Admiral Vorath stared at his screens and tried to understand what he was seeing. But his tactical computers were useless. They could not identify the ships or their weapons or their energy signatures, and then a voice spoke across all channels. Calm and clear, and somehow warm, despite the impossible power behind it. "This is the Terran continuity ship. remember why we left?" The voice said, "You called for help, and we heard you. Please identify the aggressors so we can resolve this situation peacefully." Kethra fell to her knees as the words washed over her. Terran was the ancient name for humans. She remembered that from the old records, and she understood now that the myths were true. Humanity had not died. Humanity had been waiting, and now, after 10,000 years of silence, humanity had finally come home. The human fleet hung in space like a constellation of impossible dreams, and every sensor in the system struggled to make sense of what they were seeing. Admiral Varath stood on his bridge with his hands clenched into fists, and for the first time in his long military career, he felt something he did not recognize. It was fear. The hegemony had built the most powerful warships in the known galaxy. Dreadnoughts that could destroy entire civilizations, weapons that had never known defeat. But now those ships looked like toys compared to what floated before them. The human flagship alone was larger than the entire hegemony battle group combined. A vessel so vast that it seemed less like a ship and more like a mobile world, and it glowed with energies that the Krath scientists could not identify or understand. Varath forced his voice to remain steady as he responded to the human transmission. "Grand Admiral Varath of the Krath hegemony," he said, "we do not recognize your authority here, and we do not negotiate with ghosts and legends. Withdraw your fleet or face the consequences." Silence followed his words, and then the human voice spoke again. And this time, there was something almost sad in its tone. "We hoped you would choose differently," the voice said. We have waited a very long time to return, and we did not want our first act to be one of violence. But we will not stand by while innocent people are slaughtered." Kethra listened to this exchange from her station above Ashara Prime, and she felt her hearts pounding in her chest as she tried to understand what was happening. A shuttle detached from the human flagship and began moving toward her location, and within minutes it had docked with the orbital station, moving through the hegemony fleet as if the hundreds of warships simply did not exist. The shuttle's hull was made of something that looked like flowing silver, and when it opened, Kethra found herself face to face with beings that were unmistakably human and yet somehow changed. They were tall, taller than the ancient records had suggested, and they moved with a fluid grace that reminded her of water flowing over stones. And their eyes held depths that spoke of experiences she could not begin to imagine. The leader of the group was a woman with dark skin and silver hair, and she smiled warmly as she approached Kethra. "Ambassador," she said, and her voice was the same one that had spoken across the communication channels. "My name is Shepard. I am sorry it took us so long to answer your call." Kethra struggled to find words. "You are real," she finally managed. The stories were true. Humanity did not die out. Shepard's smile grew sad around the edges. "We did not die," she agreed. "But we did change, perhaps more than you can imagine. Please come with me to our ship. There is much we need to discuss before we can resolve this situation." The journey to the human flagship was unlike anything Kethra had experienced. The shuttle did not travel through normal space, but seemed to fold reality around itself. And moments after leaving the station, they were aboard the "Remember Why We Left." The interior of the ship was vast and beautiful, with sweeping architecture that blended organic curves with geometric precision. And everywhere Kethra looked, she saw evidence of technology so advanced it might as well have been magic. Shepard led her through corridors filled with soft light and the gentle hum of systems she could not identify. And eventually, they reached a chamber with great windows that looked out at the stars. "What happened to you?" Kethra asked. "Where did you go for 10,000 years?" Shepard was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of centuries. "We looked at the galaxy," she said, "and we saw what it was, an endless cycle of war and conquest and extinction. Empires rising and falling on mountains of corpses. Species devouring each other in their hunger for power and territory. She turned to face Kethra, and her ancient eyes were filled with something that might have been grief. We saw what we could become if we stayed. Shepard continued. We saw the path that led to us becoming just another conquering empire. Just another predator species, adding our name to the long list of galactic horrors. And we could not accept that future. Kethra listened in silence as Shepard explained what humanity had done. They had retreated from the galaxy entirely, traveling to regions of space so remote that no one would find them. And there they had begun the long work of transforming themselves. They had ended their wars and unified their fractured peoples, not through force, but through patience and understanding and the slow, difficult work of building trust. They had extended their lifespans through technology and genetic engineering, living for centuries rather than decades, and they had used that time to grow wise in ways that short-lived species could not imagine. They had developed sciences that the Concord would consider impossible, learning to fold space and manipulate energy and heal wounds that should have been fatal. And they had shared this knowledge freely among themselves, until every human had access to wonders beyond counting. But most importantly, they had waited. We kept listening to the galaxy, Shepard said. We heard every war and every genocide and every cry for help. And we debated endlessly about whether we should intervene. Why did you not? Kethra asked. And she could not keep the accusation from her voice. How many could you have saved? Shepard nodded as if she had expected this question. We asked ourselves the same thing, she admitted. Every time we heard a species crying out as they were destroyed, we wondered if we were wrong to stay hidden. But we always came back to the same answer. She moved to the window and looked out at the stars. We were not ready, Shepard said. We had the power to intervene, yes, but we did not have the wisdom to do it correctly. We would have become what we fled from, another empire imposing its will on the galaxy. And eventually, we would have fallen into the same patterns as everyone else. What changed? Kethra asked. Why answer now? Shepard turned back to her with a smile that seemed to light up the room. You did, she said simply. Your message, your plea for help. It was different from all the others we have heard over the millennia. Kethra did not understand, and her confusion must have shown on her face. You did not ask for vengeance, Shepard explained. You did not ask for weapons or power or the destruction of your enemies. You simply asked for help. And that single word told us everything we needed to know. She placed her hand on Kethra's shoulder, and the touch was warm and gentle. You are ready to grow, Shepard said. Not all of you, perhaps not even most of you, but enough. And that is all we ever needed. Outside the window, the hegemony fleet began to move, and Kethra felt her chest tighten with fear. What will you do? She asked. Shepard's expression grew serious. We will show them what we have become, she said. And we will pray that it is enough to make them choose peace. Grand Admiral Vorath had built his entire life around the principles of strength and dominance. And he had conquered dozens of worlds by following a simple philosophy: the strong take what they want, and the weak suffer what they must. This philosophy had never failed him before. He studied the human fleet through his tactical displays and tried to calculate his odds of victory. But the numbers made no sense. His computers could not even determine what kind of weapons the human ships carried. His advisors urged caution, suggesting that perhaps a strategic withdrawal would be wise until they could gather more intelligence. But Vorath silenced them with a glare. The hegemony does not retreat from ghosts, he said. These humans vanished for 10,000 years because they were afraid of the galaxy. And now they return and expect us to bow before them like frightened children. I will not give them that satisfaction. He opened a channel to the human flagship. You have made a grave error coming here, Vorath said. The hegemony has crushed every enemy we have ever faced, and your ancient tricks will not save you. Leave now or be destroyed. Shepard's voice came back calm and patient. Admiral, we have no wish to harm you or your fleet, she said. Please stand down and allow us to escort your ships back to hegemony space. We can resolve this conflict through negotiation rather than violence. Vorath laughed. A harsh sound that echoed across the bridge. Negotiation is for the weak, he said. All ships, target the largest human vessel. Fire at will. The hegemony fleet unleashed everything it had. Thousands of missiles streaked through space toward the Remember Why We Left, followed by beams of concentrated energy that could have melted through a planet's core. And Vorath watched with savage anticipation as his weapons struck home. The human flagship did not move, did not attempt to evade, simply sat there as the full might of the hegemony washed over it when the light faded and the sensors cleared. Vorath felt something cold grip his heart. The human ship was completely undamaged. Its shields had not merely blocked the attack. They had absorbed it entirely, drinking in the energy as if it were nothing more than gentle rain falling on a still pond. How is that possible? One of his officers, Whisper Edvareth, did not answer because he had no answer to give. Shepard's voice spoke again. And now there was genuine sadness in her words. We tried to give you a chance, she said. We always try, but some lessons can only be learned through demonstration. Please forgive us for what comes next. The human fleet began to move. Earth had seen many things in his years of warfare, but he had never seen anything like this. The human ships did not fly through space the way normal vessels did. They seemed to simply be in one place and then another, as if the distance between them had ceased to exist. And within seconds, they had surrounded the entire hegemony formation. All ships, defensive formation, Vorath ordered. But his voice cracked with uncertainty. The human weapons were not like any weapons the galaxy had ever seen. They did not fire beams of light or launch missiles or release clouds of deadly particles. Instead, they simply reached out with fields of energy that wrapped around the hegemony ships like gentle hands. Vorath felt his dreadnought shudder as the energy field touched it, and he watched in horror as his vessel began to come apart. But it was not destruction. Not in any sense he understood. The metal of his ship separated into individual atoms, each one carefully pulled away from its neighbors and sorted into neat organized clouds that drifted harmlessly into space. And as the hull dissolved around him, Vorath felt himself being lifted by some invisible force. He materialized on the deck of a human vessel, surrounded by his crew members who had been transported in the same impossible way. And he looked around in bewilderment at the calm faces of the humans who stood watching them. The entire battle, if it could even be called that, had lasted 11 minutes. Every single hegemony warship had been completely disassembled, broken down into raw materials that floated in space like clouds of metallic dust. And every single crew member had been safely transported to human custody. Not one life had been taken. Shepard walked through the crowd of confused and frightened Krath warriors until she stood before Vorath. And she looked at him with eyes that held no anger, only a deep and ancient compassion. Do you understand now? She asked. Quiet. Livereth stared at her and tried to find his voice. You could have killed us all, he said. Your weapons could have destroyed everything we are. Yes, Shepard agreed. But what would that have proven? That we are stronger than you, that we can kill more efficiently than you can. These are not things we wish to demonstrate. She gestured at the thousands of Krath around them, warriors who had expected to die in battle, but now found themselves alive and unharmed. You will be returned to your homeworld, she said. You will face judgment from your own people for what you tried to do here, and you will have time to think about whether the path of conquest is truly the one your species wishes to walk. Vorath felt something strange happening inside him, something he had never experienced before. With shame, he had spent his entire life believing that strength meant the ability to destroy, that power meant the capacity for violence. But these humans had shown him something different true. Strength was the ability to protect without killing. True power was the capacity to defeat your enemies and then let them live. Looked at Shepard and saw not weakness, but something far more terrifying. A species that had grown so far beyond the need for violence that they could dismantle entire fleets without taking a single life. "Why?" he asked, and his voice was barely a whisper. "Why show us mercy when we showed none to you?" Shepard smiled. And it was the saddest smile Vorath had ever seen. "Because 10,000 years ago, we were exactly like you," she said. "We believed in strength through conquest. We built empires on the bones of our enemies. We glorified war and called it honor. And it nearly destroyed us." She placed her hand over her heart. "We learned a different way," she continued. "A harder way, a slower way, but a better one. And we came back to the galaxy, hoping that others might be ready to learn it too." Vorath said nothing, because there was nothing he could say. Everything he had believed about the universe had been shattered in 11 minutes. And he would spend the rest of his life trying to rebuild it into something new. The galaxy had watched the Battle of Ashar Prime in stunned silence. And when it was over, everything changed within days. Representatives from every species in the Concord were requesting meetings with the humans, desperate to understand these beings who had emerged from myth to reshape the balance of power in a single afternoon. Shepard granted every request. Humans did not behave like conquerors, did not demand tribute or territory or submission. Instead, they simply offered to talk, to answer questions, to share what they had learned during their 10,000 years of isolation. Long remained aboard to remember why we left as an unofficial ambassador. And she spent her days learning about humanity and their extraordinary journey. She learned that humans had not simply advanced their technology during their long absence. They had fundamentally transformed their society. They had eliminated poverty and hunger and disease, not through magical solutions, but through patient work and the careful distribution of resources. And they had done it by choosing to value cooperation over competition. They had extended their lifespans to centuries, and they had used that time to become wiser and more thoughtful, taking the long view on every decision because they knew they would have to live with the consequences. They had developed technologies that seemed like miracles, but they had also developed the wisdom to use those technologies responsibly, understanding that power without ethics was simply another form of destruction. Most remarkably, they had achieved something that every other galactic civilization had failed to accomplish. They had peace, not the temporary peace of exhaustion between wars, not the fragile peace of mutual fear and deterrence, but genuine lasting peace built on trust and understanding and the shared commitment to something greater than individual ambition. Kithra asked Shepard how they had done it. And Shepard laughed softly, slowly. She said, "Very slowly, we made mistakes along the way. Terrible mistakes, and we had to learn from each one. There were times when we nearly fell back into our old patterns, when fear and anger threatened to undo everything we had built." She looked out at the stars with an expression of wonder that seemed strange on someone who had lived for centuries. "But we kept trying," Shepard continued. "We kept choosing the harder path, the path of patience and forgiveness and hope, and eventually we became something new, something we could be proud of." 1 year after the Battle of Ashara Prime, the first galactic cooperative was formed. It was not a replacement for the Concord of Seven, but something different. A voluntary association of species who wanted to learn the lessons humanity had to offer. The humans did not lead this new organization. They simply participated in it as equals, sharing their knowledge freely with anyone who wished to receive it. They taught advanced medicine to species who had never known it, ending plagues that had ravaged civilizations for generations. They shared energy, technology that could power entire worlds without polluting their environments. They offered transportation systems that could move people across the galaxy in moments rather than months, and they asked for nothing in return except a single promise: use what we give you to help others. Shepard told the gathered representatives of 100 worlds, pass the knowledge forward. Break the cycle of hoarding and secrecy that has kept the galaxy divided. Become the species you were always capable of being. Not everyone accepted this offer. The hegemony of Krath withdrew to their own territory and closed their borders. Unwilling to abandon the warrior culture that had defined them for millennia, but even they no longer threatened their neighbors. Having learned through bitter experience that conquest was no longer possible in a galaxy protected by humanity, other species embraced the new way eagerly, forming partnerships and alliances that would have been unthinkable just years before. And slowly the galaxy began to transform. Kithra stood with Shepard on the observation deck of the human flagship, watching the lights of 1,000 inhabited worlds glittering against the darkness. Do you ever regret it? Kithra asked. All those years of waiting, all those civilizations you watched suffer while you stayed hidden. Shepard was quiet for a long time before answering. Every day, she admitted. We carried the weight of every life we could have saved, but did not. Every cry for help we heard, but did not answer. It is a burden we will bear forever. She turned to face Kithra with eyes that held 10,000 years of accumulated sorrow and hope. But we also know that if we had intervened too soon, we would have become part of the problem instead of the solution, Shepard said. We would have been just another empire, just another species imposing our will on others. And eventually, we would have fallen as all empires fall. She smiled, and the smile was full of light. This way is better, she continued. This way we are not saviors or conquerors, but teachers. Partners, friends, we do not give the galaxy peace. We help the galaxy build it for themselves. Kithra understood then what made humanity truly remarkable. It was not their technology or their power or their impossibly long lives. It was their patience. They had waited 10,000 years for the galaxy to be ready, and they would wait 10,000 more if necessary, because they knew that real change could not be forced. It could only be chosen in the archives of the Concord, now part of the larger cooperative. The entry on humanity had been completely rewritten. Status, active, it read. Classification, elder species, threat assessment, none. Contribution to galactic civilization, ongoing and immeasurable. And beneath the official text, in Kithra's own handwriting, was a note she had added herself. They were never a myth, she had written. They were a promise that the universe could be better, that sapient life could grow beyond its worst impulses. That hope was not just a comfort for the weak, but a foundation for the strong. They waited in the darkness between stars, not because they were afraid, but because they were patient. And now they have returned to show us the way home. The stars glittered outside the window, ancient and patient, and somewhere among them, for the first time in 12,000 years, the galaxy was truly at peace, not because humanity had imposed that peace through force, but because humanity had shown that peace was possible, and the galaxy had chosen to believe. That was the gift the humans brought with them when they emerged from myth into history. Not weapons or technology or power, just hope, and hope, it turned out, was the most powerful force in the universe.